I have participated in many study circles and diversity trainings over the years. I've been in Oregon for about 30 years, just over 30 years. And it's a long process because I'm about changing hearts and minds. And that has to be done individually, one by one, over a period of time. It's not an easy job, but it has to be done. Anyway, one of the first questions that is asked of us to consider when I do a study circle is, when was the first time you encountered racism? And I can remember back to when I was 5 years old. I don't know how your memory is, but I can remember back to 5 years old. And one incident in particular I want to tell you about, I call it Train Trip to Mississippi. I will be telling 3 stories, and I'm going to start with that one, Train Trip to Mississippi. And then I'm going to go right into A Woman in the Snow, and then my final story would be the story of the eagle. Anyway, I was 5 years old, and it was summertime, and my dad had given my mom and me and my brother permission to go to Mississippi to see my grandmother. And I was so excited because I was in my grown-up little navy blue coat and matching hat and my black patent leather shoes and my little white ankle socks, you know, and I had on a nice a Sunday dress, and I was sharp. And you know, my brother was there, but he didn't count much because he was still in diapers. But anyway, I was it. And my dad took us to the train station in Chicago, and it was the first time I was there. It was huge, and people were everywhere, and walking and standing around in long lines. And then when we got to the place where the trains were, they were so big. They were like gigantic. And some were standing still, and some were slowly leaving, you know, going someplace. And I was kind of worried how we were going to get on the right train. I mean, how did Mom know which train to get on? But when we got on the train, and a man would come by in blue uniform, almost matched my outfit. So I thought it was pretty sharp. And he'd ask for tickets please. And my mother would give him the ticket, and he'd punch it full of holes and hand it back to her. And that happened several times. And then we had to change trains. And another guy would come in another blue suit, and he would ask for tickets. And when he came and asked for her ticket, she handed him the ticket, and he said, "Where's hers?" You know, pointing to me. And my mother said, "Well, she doesn't have one. She doesn't need one. She's only 5. And the rule says under 5, well, under 12 actually it was, you don't need a ticket. She's taking up a seat, ain't she?" And I don't remember all the conversation. I remember this. After that man left, my mother pulled me into her lap, and she held me the rest of the trip, and she cried. And I remember thinking, I hate that man for making my mother cry. And because she wouldn't let go of me, and she didn't have much room because she already had Paul in her lap. And so I was very uncomfortable. And when we got back to Chicago, my mother told my dad what had happened, and he never allowed us to ride the train again. That was my first encounter with racism. Now, my parents never explained to me what was going on. They never did. I just thought my parents were mean, and they were stingy, they were strict. I mean, there were places where I couldn't go. There were things that I couldn't do, and I didn't know the reason why I couldn't do them. I mean, my brother and I knew that when we started south, and we would go every year almost to visit our grandparents, because everybody was alive then, and it was an annual trip for us. We'd drive in the car. But my brother and I knew that 2 rules existed. On this trip that took all day to drive, 8.5 hours, you don't ask Mom and Dad, can you stop at a restaurant? Or if McDonald's, I think McDonald's was the first fast food place I can remember. You don't ask if you can stop and have a hamburger or whatever you think you want to eat, because the answer is no. You don't ask Mom and Dad, can you go to the bathroom, because the answer is no. I thought they were mean. I thought that they didn't, want us to have anything to eat. And they didn't want us to, go to the bathroom. Maybe we're just not supposed to go, I never knew, all while I was growing up, that the bathrooms were for white people only. I never knew that the restaurants were for white people only. I never knew that there was no place that we could stay for the night because it was white people only. I never knew that, all while I was growing up. Never knew it. And they didn't tell me. I remember one time my dad stopped at a gas station, and it must not have been one of his regular gas stations. And I was allowed to get out the car. And you know how kids are. I mean, I've been in the car all day, and I was allowed to get out, and I was acting silly, and I was jumping all around. And I got to the building, and I saw a sign over a door that said, white only. I stopped and I read it over and over and over, and I couldn't understand what that meant. And so finally I said to myself, oh, well, what do you care? You're not white. And I danced on off. And I never knew that that was probably a bathroom. And if I had opened the door or gone in, they would have said to me, can't you read? Well, yeah, I can read. Well, but this is a case where if you don't understand the meaning behind the words, then you really haven't read it, right? And that's what I tell my children, when I was teaching children. Okay, I want to go right into Woman in the Snow. This story begins about 1935 in a fairly large southern city. Grady Bishop knew that when he put on his gray uniform and got on his bus, he had power. He had just recently been hired by the Metro Bus Company. And he knew that being obese, being poorly educated, being the 11th child of the town drunk, none of that mattered. Only power mattered, and driving gave him power. He reported for work one cold November afternoon. He had the 3 to 11 o'clock shift. He clocked in. The route manager said, Grady, you got the Hall Street Express. The Blackbird Express again. Grady didn't care who knew his nickname for that particular route. Most drivers didn't like the route because it looped back and forth like a retreating snake. And when weather was bad, ice and snow, it was a really hazardous route to drive in a bus or anything. But Grady had his own reason for disliking the route. That particular route picked up maids and cooks, domestics, on the east side of town and carried them to the west side of town where they worked, and then back again home. And he couldn't stand being a chauffeur for a bunch of black folks. He started to say something to Billy, but he kind of thought better of it. He says, well, I'm lucky to have a job in such hard times, and I'm still on probation, so maybe I better keep my mouth shut. So he got on the bus, and he pulled out of the barn at 3:01. It had already started to snow. Billy had told him that if the weather got really bad, just shut the route down and bring the bus on in. And as he picked up people, and the weather got worse and worse, and he was, yelling at them, hurry up, you folks get in the back of the bus, you know the rules, hurry up. Auntie, is there some reason you're taking your sweet time getting off this bus? The elderly black woman, she carefully stepped down on the slippery steps and stepped onto the ground. Then she turned and she looked at Grady and she said, Auntie, I can't believe you call me Auntie. I didn't know my brother had a white son. she walked on off. Grady got 2 shades of red. Listen, you uppity, don't get uppity with me. You know auntie is what we call all you old colored women. Can't be nice to some people. Shut the door. Weather had worsened, and Grady decided to turn the bus in. He looked at his watch, and luckily he was still on time. It was just a little after 9 o'clock. So he's turning the bus slowly at the east side loop, and his headlights picked up the form of a young woman struggling to get to the bus. He looked, and she couldn't have been more than 20 years old. But what really upset him was she didn't have on a hat or a coat or boots or anything. She was struggling against the wind and the snow that was in her face. And as she got closer, he saw that she was clutching something to her chest. And it turned out to be a baby. And he said, these people, what is wrong with them? And he watched her as she came around to the bus, and he stopped. He opened the door, and he said, look, miss, I've decided to close the route down. I'm headed in, the route's closed. She got on the bus. She said, but mister, my baby is sick, and my husband has gone to Memphis to look for work. I gotta get to the hospital. Please take me to the hospital. Grady thought about it. Well, I gotta pass the hospital. Yeah, you can ride that far. Pay your fare and go sit down. She looked at the ground. I don't have the money, but I promise you I'll pay you tomorrow. I promise I'll pay you tomorrow. You know the rules. No fare, no ride. But please, my child is sick. I know she's going to die if I don't get her to the hospital. Feel her head. Grady recoiled. You gals, you young gals, you just worried over nothing. A little fever, what's that? Just go home and put her to bed. She'll be fine in the morning. Please, mister, don't make me get off the bus. Please, here, take my gold ring, take my wedding ring. It's made out of gold. Just don't let me get off the bus, please. Get off the bus. You know the rules. He watched her as she slowly got down off the steps. He closed the door, but he could hear her crying. He could the baby crying. Or was it just the wind? The next day, he happened to be reading the newspaper, and he learned that it was a record snowfall, and the temperature had dropped down to freezing. Some reason his eyes caught a little article, said colored woman and baby found frozen in the snow. Grady looked at it, he said, now that gal would have been okay if she had done like I told her and gone home. He turned to the comics and didn't think any more about it. 1 year to the day, Grady again reported for work for the 3 to 11 o'clock shift. Again, snow was predicted. Again, it snowed. The weather got terrible, and Grady had decided to take the bus in. Just as he was going around the east side loop, his headlights picked up that same young woman struggling to get to the bus. Fear went all through him. He said, it can't be the same woman, but it is the same woman. He heard his father's voice in his mind, slurred with alcohol. It ain't the same woman, dummy. You know they all look alike. But it was, it is. But where was she coming from? The thought was too horrible for him to think about. He was so afraid. Fear made him step on the gas pedal. The bus lunged out into the street. A truck was coming, headlights. And then fear made him slam on the brakes. And the back of the bus swirled, out into the street and slammed into a tree. His stomach was crushed into the steering wheel, and it ruptured his liver and his spleen. As he closed his eyes for the final time, he thought, "You've done it this time, blockhead." He heard the moaning of the wind. 25 years later, Metro Bus Company hired their first black driver. His name was Ted Hammond. He was a war hero, and he had 2 years of college. Nice young man. As his wife fixed his tie on his uniform, he said, "You know, I'm the first black driver and that the bus company has hired, and they assigned me the Hall Street Express permanently." His wife said, "Well, what did you expect?" She said, "You just do the best that you can so it'll be easier for those that come after you." A lot of changes had happened, in the two and a half decades that had passed by. I mean, the military had integrated, The Supreme Court in 1954 had declared separate schools were not equal, were unequal. The bus boycott had happened, and Dr. Martin Luther King had led that successfully. And all this was the reason that Ray had his job. And he was grateful for that job. So he went to work November, and he was doing the 3 to 11 o'clock shift. When he came into the barn, the white driver said, "Hey, Ray, look out for Eula May." And he said, "I didn't know white folks believed in haints." All his life, all of his childhood, he had heard the story of Eula May Daniels and how drivers and passengers had seen her on the first snowfall running for the bus. And so he got on the bus, and the route manager told him, "If it gets too bad, bring the bus in." So the weather got worse, and it was about 9 o'clock, and he was sitting there at the East Side Loop, and he decided to take the bus in, close the route down. And just as he sat there, he spied her running toward the bus. She looked just like the story said. He could see her. She was young. She was younger than his own wife. She was only about 20 years old, and she was running, trying to get to the bus. And he looked at her, and he was afraid. He was so afraid. But as she got closer, he thought, "There, but for the grace of God, is one of my own. Nobody deserves to be left out in the snow." And as she came around to the door, he opened the door. He could see the snow falling right through her body. She looked up at him, and she was startled. He had seen that look before, but not on a dead person, though. And he said, "Oh, it's okay, honey, it's okay." He says, "I'm the first Negro driver Metro has hired. Come on up, come on out the snow." And she kind of floated up the stairs. He could hear the baby crying. And she looked down at the floor. She says, "I gotta get to the hospital. Would you please take me?" He says, "Well, first of all, look up. There's no cause for shame. Look at me." And she said, "But I don't have any money. I can't pay the fare." He said, "Well, the rule books say that if you don't have any money, I'm not supposed to let you ride. But," and he reached into his pockets, "the rule books don't say anything about a personal loan." And he fished out the money. He found the dime, and he put it in the box. "There, you're all paid up. Go have a seat." And she started for the back of the bus. He says, "No, you don't have to sit way back there now. You can come and sit up front with me." She sat halfway. He says, "Well, let me carefully see if I can get this bus out of here and get you to the hospital." And so he slowly turned the bus around and got it on the street, and he was so nervous. He just kept talking. He says, "Well, a lot of things have happened since you've been away, and I owe my job to a little lady just about your size by the name of Rosa Parks. And she refused to give up her seat one day because she was a colored woman. And the black people got together and they decided to boycott the bus. And it was led by a young doctor, a young preacher, Dr. Martin Luther King. And he's going to go far. He's a smart man. And Ray didn't know why he was just jammering off at the mouth, but he just couldn't stop. And he was so cold at first. And so he would try to look and see her in his rearview mirror, but her reflection, there was no reflection. So every now and then when he dared, he'd look over his right shoulder to see if she was really still sitting there. Yeah, she was. Nobody was going to believe this. I don't believe this myself, you know. And so he kept talking, and then finally it began to get a little warmer in the bus, and the baby stopped crying, and he got to the hospital, and he says, Miss, he says, there's your hospital, this is your stop. He says, I hope the baby will be okay. And she says, thank you, you've been very kind. And as he watched her get off the bus, he called her, he said, Miss, about the fare, you don't have to make a special trip back. Just consider it a gift. And she turned and she smiled. He watched her walk up the steps. And as she walked up the steps, she disappeared. And she was never seen again. There was a farmer. He raised white leghorn chickens. And for a long time, the chicken business wasn't doing very well. As a matter of fact, the farmer was going broke. And like anybody going broke, he was not too happy. A friend of his came by one day and he said, well, you know, I got me an idea. Why don't you go out into the woods, you know, build yourself a trap, go out into the woods and catch you a live eagle. And, you know, bring her back and, you know, put her in a viewing cage and charge people money. And you'll make lots of money, you know, because people haven't seen a real live eagle up close. The farmer thought this was a good idea to make some money, and so he made himself a trap and he went up into the woods, and by he really did catch himself a live eagle. He brought that eagle back and he tried to transfer her into the viewing cage, a bigger cage that he had made. But this eagle was wild. And whenever the farmer got close to her, she would bite at him and claw him and bite and claw him, until finally the farmer got mad. And he went into his house and came back with his shotgun and shot the eagle dead. And when all she wanted was her freedom. The same friend came by and he said, listen, he says, if you go back up into the woods right away, maybe you can find her nest. And if you're lucky, maybe there'll be eggs in the nest. If you bring those 2 eggs back and if you put them under one of your laying hens and they hatch, they won't know who they are. They'll think they're chickens. And if they think they're chickens, they won't claw you or fight you or anything because they won't know who they are. The farmer thought this was a great idea. He went back up into the woods, he found that nest, and he come back with these 2 eagle eggs, and he set them up on one of his laying hens, and by, one of the eggs hatched. Now you got to understand, this little eagle hatched, and all he saw was chickens. He thought he was a chicken. And when the farmer came near him, he would run away because he was scared of the farmer. The farmer liked that, and he called him Uncle Tom. Now, Uncle Tom was happy being a chicken. He did what all the other chickens did, run around the barnyard, played with the chickens, ate with the chickens, everything. Until one day he saw himself, his reflection, in a little stream of water. And the first thing he noticed was, oh my God, I'm not white like the other chickens. And what's with the feathers on the head? They stuck up straight. They didn't lie down slick like they did on the other chickens' heads. And so he got some porcelana and rubbed it in those feathers and lightened them up. And he got some jerry curl and slicked those feathers down on his head. And then he felt better about himself. Well, about this time, the other egg hatched. I don't know what was wrong with that eagle when he hatched. But for some reason, when the farmer came over, he planted his foot and looked at the farmer. The farmer didn't like that too much, and he named him Turk. Right away, Uncle Tom comes running over to Brother Turk, and he says, I'm the older brother, so you call me Uncle Tom, okay? And take this porcelana and rub on them feathers and lighten them up, and take this jerry curl and stick them feathers down. And Turk said, but I kind of like my color and my feathers the way they are. Well, at least take this silk scarf and tie them feathers down some. Do something, man, do something. But Turk didn't do anything. So Uncle Tom just stomped off in disgust and went on about his business and left Turk standing there in the barnyard, just standing there looking up at the sky, because somehow Turk felt like that's where he belonged, up in the sky. One day he was standing there and a dot appeared in the sky. And as that dot got closer to where he was standing, it became the biggest bird that Turk had ever seen in his life. Now you and I know that was an eagle, but Turk didn't know that. And the old eagle, he looked at Turk standing on the ground with all those chickens all around, and he landed on a branch overlooking the barnyard, and he said in this deep eagle voice, "What are you doing down there with all those chickens?" And Turk looked up with his little eagle voice. He says, "I'm a chicken." And the old eagle said, "You're not a chicken." And Turk said, "What am I?" "You're an eagle." Turk said, "What's an eagle?" "Boy, come on up here and let me tell you your history and tell you who you are." "You know us chickens can't fly that high. I told you you're not a chicken, you're an eagle. Now spread those wings." And so Turk spread his wings. They were big too. He said, "Flap them wings, flap them, harder, harder, harder." And Turk, to his amazement, flew up to where the old eagle was sitting on the branch. He said, "Settle yourself down, boy. Let me tell you who you are." He said, "Your father is the strongest bird in the sky. Nobody can fly higher or further than he can without stopping. And your mother flew beside him. And you they son, that's who you are." "Oh, wow," says Turk. "Wow." He says, but you see, I'm kind of brown. I'm not white like the other chickens. I keep telling you, you're not a chicken, boy." He said, "Do you know what that color represents? That color represents royalty." "Woo, that's heavy," says Turk. He said, "Well, what about my feathers on my head? They stick straight up. They don't lay down flat." "That's your crown," says the old eagle. He says, "You're royalty." "Ooh, that's deep," says Turk. "We got to tell Uncle Tom. We got to tell Uncle Tom." He looked down on the ground. He called to him, "Uncle Tom, come on up here. This man is telling us all about our history, and it's beautiful." Uncle Tom looked up. "History? I don't have time for no history. I'm too busy getting these crumbs up off the ground. And you better come down out that tree before you get us all into trouble." The old eagle looked at him and says, "Oh, he don't want to know about his history. Let's you and I fly off to our destiny." And so the old eagle and the young eagle, they take to the sky, flying side by side. And it wasn't long before they were flying over this deep, deep valley. And Turk got afraid. He says, "Oh, we gonna die. And the old eagle says, "Oh no, this is the valley of oppression. but we're not going to die because we have the strength of kings in our wings. And so they flew on. They don't fly too much longer before they're flying over this desert, vast desert. I mean, Turk didn't see any trees, no place to land, no bushes, no nothing. And he says, oh, we gonna crash, we gonna crash. And the old eagle says, no, we're not gonna crash. This is the desert of mediocrity. You know, the place where it's okay not to work, you know, where sea average is good enough. We know where there's no food, there's no water, but we're gonna fly on because we have the strength of kings in our wings. And so they fly on. And they don't fly too much longer before they're confronted with a huge mountain. Turk didn't see any way over it, didn't see any way around it. And he's, oh, we're gonna crash, we're gonna crash. But the old eagle says, oh, no, no, no. This is the mountain of injustice. But we're not gonna crash because we have the strength of kings in our wings. And so they flew on. And so this is the message to me, brothers and sisters. You got to choose to be eagles, no matter what. And fly on, and fly on.
I don't need that thing. My mouth is big enough. We're recording.
Yes, you do.
Record. Okay.
Yeah, that's right, you do.
I do. So we did this a little bit in reverse. So I'm not doing an intro for Paulette. I'm doing an outro. We wanted Paulette to just come up and tell her stories. Paulette has been a librarian in the Springfield School District. She's been an educator for as long as I've known her, which has been about
at least 25 years.
25 years or so. And her children have come to Lane. Her son was a rites of passage student many years ago. He went to the Army and he came back and became a student again at Lane. So
he's 24.
Yeah, so we have a little bit of a relationship here in terms of our school. But I want to thank Paulette for those wonderful stories. And this is the way that we wanted to kick off our day today, is for you to understand the stories that come from all of us. All of us have a story. Maybe some of us have many stories, but those stories reflect who we are and where we're going. And Paulette, thank you very much for presenting for us this morning. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to James.
Oh, good.
James, you're on.
Thank you.